You know that feeling when you check your bank account at the end of the month and there's just not much there? Like you worked the whole month, you were busy, you were stressed, you skipped lunches, you stayed late, and somehow at the end of it all, the number on the screen barely moved. Maybe it even went down. And the wild part is, you can't really explain where it all went. Rent, sure. Groceries, yeah. But the rest of it, it just kind of dissolved into subscriptions you forgot about, into a dinner out that felt justified because you'd had a rough week, into little purchases that each made total sense in the moment but somehow added up to nothing. And here's the thing, that feeling doesn't go away when you get a raise. It doesn't go away when you get a better job. I've talked to people earning 80, 90, even $100,000 a year who feel exactly that same quiet panic every time they open their banking app. My name is Adam, and honestly, I spend probably too much time thinking about money. Not in an obsessive spreadsheet on a Saturday kind of way, but more like I'm genuinely fascinated by why some people seem to slowly, almost quietly build real financial security, while others stay stuck at the same level for years, sometimes decades, despite working just as hard, maybe harder. That question has kind of taken over my brain. And the more I've dug into it, the more I've realized that the answer isn't really about income. It's not about being smart. It's not even about luck most of the time. It's about a handful of invisible patterns that almost nobody talks about. And today, I want to walk you through them. Because here's what I think is going to surprise you. Most of the reasons people never cross that $50,000 net worth threshold have almost nothing to do with math. They have everything to do with psychology, identity, and the few deeply human habits that feel completely normal until you see them for what they really are. This isn't going to be a lecture. I'm not going to hand you a budget template and tell you to stop buying coffee. What I want to do is show you the actual mechanics behind why financial progress stalls and, more importantly, what it looks like when people finally break through. So let's get into it. Let's start with the most common trap, and honestly, the one that catches even really intelligent people off guard. There's this deeply held belief that if you just earn more money, the financial stress goes away. Like the problem is the income, so the solution is more income. And on the surface, that makes complete sense. But here's what actually happens. You get the raise, or the promotion, or you pick up extra work. And for maybe a month, 2 months, things feel a little looser. And then, almost without deciding to, your life expands to fill the new income. You move to a slightly nicer apartment. You upgrade the car because, well, you can finally afford a better one. You start eating out a bit more because you've earned it. And suddenly, you're back to the same feeling. Busy, working hard, and somehow not getting ahead. Economists have a name for this. They call it lifestyle inflation, or lifestyle creep. But I think those terms kind of undersell how sneaky it is, because it doesn't feel like inflation, it feels like progress. It feels like finally living the way you should be living given how hard you work. I have a friend, let's call him Lewis. Lewis is one of the most hardworking people I know. He went from making $35,000 a year in his mid-20s to clearing over $90,000 by his early 30s. And at 33, his net worth was barely $20,000. Not because he was irresponsible, not because he was blowing money on wild things, but because every single time his income went up, his lifestyle quietly matched it. New income, new baseline. Always comfortable, never compounding. The turning point for Lewis wasn't finding a new income stream. It was realizing that he'd been treating every raise as permission to spend more, rather than as an opportunity to save more. Once he started saving a meaningful percentage of every raise before he had the chance to lifestyle inflate into it, things started to shift. The takeaway here is really simple, but it's hard to implement. Your savings rate matters infinitely more than your income level. A person earning $50,000 and saving 20% of it will, over time, massively out-accumulate someone earning $100,000 and saving 2%. The math is almost embarrassingly straightforward, but the psychology of it, resisting the urge to let your lifestyle expand, that's the actual challenge. The emergency that never ends, living without a financial floor.
Okay, so here's something that I think is genuinely underappreciated when we talk about why people can't build net worth. It's not just spending, it's the absence of a buffer. When you don't have any savings, like truly none, or maybe just a couple $100s, every single unexpected expense becomes a financial emergency. The car needs a repair, the dentist finds something, the laptop dies. And because there's no cushion, you have to handle it with debt, usually credit card debt, or by pulling money from wherever you can find it. And here's the cruel part. The interest on that debt then becomes a permanent drain on your future income. So you're not just dealing with the cost of the emergency, you're dealing with the cost of the emergency plus 10, 15, 25% interest, sometimes years afterward. This is what I think of as the financial floor problem. People who can't build net worth often don't have a floor. Every time they get a little bit ahead, life sends something their way and knocks them back down. And it's not bad luck exactly, or at least it's not unusually bad luck. Unexpected expenses are just part of life. But when you don't have a buffer, normal life events become setbacks. Think about it this way. Imagine you're trying to fill a bathtub, but the drain is partially open. You can keep adding water, but until you figure out the drain situation, you're fighting a losing battle. The drain for a lot of people is the cycle of debt repayment eating into income that could otherwise be saved. The practical thing here is, and I know this sounds almost too basic, is that the very first financial goal anyone should have isn't investing, isn't paying off all their debt, isn't buying a house, it's building a small, untouchable emergency fund. Even $1,000 changes the game. Because once you have that floor, a flat tire is an inconvenience, not a crisis. And avoiding crisis mode is how you start actually accumulating.
This one is a little more uncomfortable to talk about, but I think it might be the most important one on this list. And it took me a while to really see it clearly. A huge amount of the money people spend isn't really about the thing they're buying. It's about the story they're telling, to themselves and to other people, about who they are. The nice car, the designer bag, the always eating at good restaurants, the latest phone the day it drops. A lot of the spending is identity spending. It's purchasing a version of yourself that you want to project, or that you feel you deserve, or that you've convinced yourself is just how you live. And look, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with enjoying nice things. That's not the point. The point is that when your spending is driven by identity rather than genuine enjoyment or value, it becomes really hard to cut back on because cutting back feels like an attack on who you are, not just a financial adjustment, a personal one. I remember talking to someone once who was genuinely struggling financially, carrying significant credit card debt, no savings, but would not, under any circumstances, stop going to expensive brunch every single Sunday. And when I gently asked about it, she said something really revealing. She said, "That's just who I am. I'm someone who appreciates good food and good experiences." And I understood that. I really did. But what she was actually saying was, this isn't a financial decision, it's an identity decision. And identity decisions are almost impossible to budget your way out of. The question worth sitting with is, which parts of your spending are genuinely making your life better? And which parts are just maintaining an image, either for yourself or for others? Because the image is expensive. And often, if you're honest with yourself, it's not even an image you consciously chose. It's one you inherited from the people around you, or from what you saw on social media, or from some idea of what a successful, put-together adult is supposed to look like. The comparison economy, keeping up is keeping you broke, which brings me to something that has gotten dramatically worse in the last 10 years. And I think it's doing real damage to people's finances in ways they don't fully recognize. We are constantly, relentlessly exposed to other people's highlight reels, and not just celebrities, our actual peers, people we went to school with, colleagues, people our age. And the financial behavior of the people around us, or the people we perceive ourselves to be similar to, has an enormous influence on what we think is normal spending. If everyone in your social circle is taking international holidays twice a year, driving relatively new cars, and eating at nice restaurants regularly,
That starts to feel like the baseline, not the ceiling, the baseline. And spending below that baseline starts to feel like falling behind, even if the baseline is actually built on a foundation of debt and financial fragility. This is sometimes called social comparison theory in psychology, and it's well documented that our financial decisions are heavily influenced by what we see around us. The problem is that what we see around us is, increasingly, a curated and often financially dishonest version of reality. People post a vacation, not the credit card bill they're still paying off 8 months later. There was actually a study, I think it was from Princeton, that found lottery winners' neighbors were more likely to go bankrupt after the win than people in areas without lottery winners. Because seeing someone nearby suddenly spend more raised the perceived normal spending level, and people stretched to keep up. That's how powerful this effect is. It can bankrupt you even when someone else is getting richer. The antidote to this is something I describe as building your own financial reference points, which basically means stop measuring yourself against what other people appear to be doing, and start measuring yourself against your own goals, your own values, your own version of security. That sounds simple, but it's genuinely hard when you live in a world that's designed to make you feel like you're behind. The passive wealth gap, the difference between active and passive money. Here's something that most people in the under 50,000 net worth category have in common. Almost all of their financial activity is active, meaning they work, they get paid, they spend. Work, get paid, spend. The money they have is entirely dependent on them continuing to show up and trade their time for it. People who build real net worth, even modest net worth, we're not talking about the ultra rich here, almost all have some element of passive or compounding activity working in their favor. That could be investments growing over time. It could be a savings account that earns interest. It could be a small business. It could be real estate. But the key thing is their money is doing some of the work, not just them. Now, I know what you're thinking. Adam, I don't have enough money to invest. I can barely cover my bills. And I hear that. I genuinely do. But here's the thing. The compounding effect doesn't require a large initial amount. It requires time and consistency. Someone who starts putting away even $50 a month into a low-cost index fund at 25 will, by 65, have accumulated a genuinely meaningful sum. Not because $50 a month is a lot of money, but because 40 years of compound growth is a very powerful force. The tragedy is that most people delay starting because they feel like the amount is too small to matter. And that delay, that 5 years, 10 years of waiting until they feel like they have enough to really invest, is often the single most expensive financial decision they ever make. Not a bad stock pick, not a failed business, just waiting. Okay, I want to talk about something a little more psychological now, because I think it explains a lot. A significant number of people who are stuck financially have one thing in common beyond their spending habits. They avoid looking. They don't check their accounts regularly. They don't know their exact monthly expenses. They don't know how much debt they have, down to the dollar. They have a vague sense that things are not great, and they've developed a habit of not looking too closely because looking closely feels bad. This is called financial avoidance, and it's extremely common. And I understand it, honestly. There's a very human instinct to avoid information that's going to make you feel anxious or ashamed. If you already know your finances aren't in great shape, checking your balance every day just feels like signing up for daily anxiety, so you don't look. And not looking feels, in the short term, like a form of relief. But here's the problem. Financial avoidance is like avoiding a suspicious noise in your car's engine. In the short term, not thinking about it means you don't have to deal with it. But the longer you ignore it, the worse the underlying problem gets. And when it finally forces itself into your attention, it's almost always more expensive and more stressful than if you just dealt with it early. The people who start building net worth almost always have one thing in common. They know their numbers. They might not love their numbers. The numbers might make them uncomfortable. But they look, they track, they know exactly where they stand, which means they can make real decisions instead of vague, anxious guesses. The "I'll start when" trap. Why the timing never feels right. There's one more pattern I want to address before we wrap up, and it's maybe the most quietly destructive of all of them. It's the habit of conditional starting. I'll start saving when I pay off this credit card. I'll start investing when I'm earning more. I'll get serious about this when things settle down a bit. I'll deal with it after the holidays. Sound familiar? Honestly, I've said versions of these things myself. There's always a reason why right now isn't quite the right time to start. And the thing is, individually, each of those reasons sounds completely reasonable. Of course, it makes sense to wait until the debt is paid off. Of course, it makes sense to wait until income is more stable. But here's the brutal truth. The conditions are never going to be perfect. There is no version of life where everything settles down and suddenly there's an obvious window to start building wealth. Life doesn't do that. It just keeps throwing things at you. And the people who build net worth don't do it when things are perfect. They do it alongside the imperfection, in whatever form that takes for them. Start small. Start now. Start imperfectly. The gap between someone who starts with $50 a month and someone who keeps waiting to start properly is not $50 a month. Over a decade, over 2 decades, that gap becomes enormous, not just financially, but in terms of habit, confidence, and financial identity. So let's bring this together. We've covered a lot of ground here, and I don't want you to walk away feeling overwhelmed. So let me just say this simply. Most people don't cross the $50,000 net worth threshold not because they're irresponsible or unintelligent or unlucky. They don't cross it because of a combination of quiet, invisible patterns, lifestyle inflation that matches every raise, the absence of a financial floor that turns every setback into a crisis, identity-driven spending that feels non-negotiable, social comparison that distorts what normal looks like, a gap between active income and any kind of compounding activity, financial avoidance that keeps them from really knowing their numbers, and the always present habit of waiting for a better moment to start. None of these are character flaws. Every single one of them is a completely understandable human response to the financial world we actually live in. But understanding them, really seeing them clearly, is the beginning of being able to change them. Here's what I want you to take away from this. You don't need a dramatic overhaul. You don't need to turn your whole life upside down. The shift, when it happens, usually looks pretty quiet from the outside. It looks like someone who starts tracking their spending even though it's uncomfortable. It looks like someone who decides to save 15% of their next raise before they get used to it. It looks like someone who opens an investment account with a small amount and doesn't touch it. It looks like someone who stops measuring their life against the curated financial image of people they follow online and starts measuring it against what actually matters to them. These are small decisions, but small decisions made consistently over time are exactly how financial security is built. Not in one dramatic moment, not with a windfall or a secret strategy or a perfect opportunity, but slowly, quietly, one good decision at a time. If you're sitting at 0 right now, or 10,000 or 30,000, that's not a ceiling. That's a starting point. And the fact that you're watching this, thinking about this, trying to understand this, that matters more than you might think. The people who change their financial trajectory aren't always the ones who know the most. They're the ones who decide to look clearly at where they are and then take the next small step. Whatever that looks like for you. You've got this.